Welcome to Cool Talk. In 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the first and only president to be elected for a third term. He had promised the American people the United States would not participate in World War II, but all the while preparing troops and stockpile weapons just in case. Now, Roosevelt was feeling the strain. Winston Churchill was struggling in Germany. Hitler's army would bombard Britain and Britain would bombard back. A sad consequence is that a new kind of warfare began, where you bombard civilians, cities and towns were being bombed on both sides. In the end, 50 million people across the world would die. Now, Eleanor was very involved in his decision making. She was a very active first lady. She set the standard for first ladies to come. She had his ear. Even though their marriage was now a marriage in name only, there was still a genuine affection and they cared for each other. Eleanor worried about him, though she traveled the country meeting people of every race, creed, color, nationality, and sexual orientation. To say that she was ahead of her time was an understatement. Now, Roosevelt had stopped sending convoys of weapons to Britain, worried that a German submarine could attack and bring the nation to war. It was in June of that year that Hitler decided to target the Soviet Union. It was a big mistake. The Soviets fought back hard. They eventually won, but it was at a big price. Over 20 million Soviet military and civilians had died before the end of the war. Roosevelt placed an embargo against Japan for war materials and oil. This heightened the tensions between the countries. Now, remember how Roosevelt favored labor and never sent troops in to break up strikes? Well, when the war production plants began to strike and have sit-down strikes, Roosevelt lost his patience. The war production was crucial. When a strike broke out at an aviation plant, Roosevelt sent in the troops. One worker was injured with a bayonet and the strike was over. Other war production plant workers who had threatened to strike now backed off. In August, Winston Churchill met Franklin D. Roosevelt for the first time. Now, Churchill didn't get everything he wanted, and Franklin D. Roosevelt felt that he had done very well, but a staff member told him to be careful. Churchill may have been charming him by letting him win the first round. Now, Churchill found that Franklin D. Roosevelt was a very charming man. Roosevelt felt that Churchill was very intelligent, considering he was drunk half the time. Now, Churchill did get Roosevelt to agree to send convoys to help patrols getting to Britain with war supplies. And Roosevelt also opened selective services, which angered isolationists who wanted to stay out of war. Now, Roosevelt was not allowed to send weapons to Britain by law, but he bent the law in such a way that if he had been found out, he probably would have been impeached. You see, you could trade weapons or sell weapons to any country that you wanted. You just couldn't send them over. There were other instances like this where Roosevelt, well, he probably thought of the greater good, but he bent the rules considerably. In September, a United States destroyer, the Kearney, was sunk by a German torpedo, and now many people who were against the war now screamed that we had to do something. The truth, however, was that our destroyer had been following the German submarine and it had defended itself. Another destroyer was sunk soon afterwards. All in all, over 100 died in both attacks. By this point, American cryptologists had broken the Japanese code. They knew that a Japanese attack was imminent. Now, Secretary of State Cordell Hull was negotiating with the Japanese, but this was all a farce. The United States knew that the Japanese were going to attack, they just didn't know where, and they needed time to prepare their weapons and their stockpiles. The Japanese, in the meantime, needed to buy time so they could prepare the attack. Well, it finally happened. December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked an American naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 5 battleships were sunk, 200 planes were destroyed, and 2,300 servicemen had died. Franklin D. Roosevelt called a congressional meeting calling for war and declaring December 7, 1941, a day that would live in infamy. War was declared. It was at this time that Roosevelt had 100,000 Americans of Japanese descent rounded up and put into relocation camps around the country during the duration of the war. Canada had agreed to do the same. Japanese discrimination and racism became vicious and spread across the country. Now, Eleanor pleaded with Roosevelt not to do this, but he was adamant. This was a sad chapter in Roosevelt's administration. Now, while the American boys went off to war, the American women were going to the factories. Wartime production skyrocketed, and take it any way you can, but basically the war is what pulled the United States out of the Depression. Now, Albert Einstein had written Roosevelt about the possibility of Germany building an atomic bomb. Roosevelt felt the United States had no choice. It would build one first, and the Manhattan Project was born with almost unlimited funding. Roosevelt also ordered the production of poisons for biological warfare. Now, Roosevelt met with Churchill again several times actually, and this time with Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, who was also now embroiled in this war and was now not very trusted ally. There were plans made, alliances, a new joint chief of staffs. Generals surged, Eisenhower, Patton, Marshall. Huge battles broke out, Stalingrad, Leningrad, Normandy, Operation Overlord, all over Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe. The war went on year after year, all throughout Roosevelt's third terms. Millions had died. There was no end in sight. There was the Battle of the Atlantic, Operation Torch in Morocco, the Battle of Sicily, Anzio, Italy, the invasion at Normandy, D-Day. There was Operation Dragoon, Operation Market Garden, Bataan, Manila, the Battle of Coral Sea, Midway, Guam, and the Battle of Iwo Jima. Now, in January of 1945, the Soviets managed to liberate Warsaw, Poland. They also were able to liberate the survivors of the Holocaust in Auschwitz concentration camp. You might remember this famous photograph in the Battle of Iwo Jima. 26,000 Americans died there. The average age was 17. And in the bombing of Tokyo, 100,000 Japanese died, over 1 million were injured. Now, Roosevelt completed his third term, and believe it or not, he decided to run again. A fourth term, hoping to see this war to the end. He won, but he had chosen Missouri Senator Harry Truman to be his vice president, believing he would best carry out his policies if he was to pass away. Roosevelt was so old and sickly, he didn't even take the oath of office in the Capitol. He took it inside the White House. He was frail looking, his hands shook, he would stumble over his words. And yet he traveled, went around trying to do the best he could, even went to Egypt to negotiate for Jewish settlements there for after the war. He failed. Well, being sick, he decided to go to Warm Springs, Georgia to relax. While he was relaxing in Georgia, he still kept in touch with the world. And then one day, while having his portrait taken, he complained of a headache, slumped over in his chair, and died of a hemorrhage. The country was heartbroken. A whole generation had never known another president besides FDR. An all-too-human man who couldn't walk led the country through the Great Depression and World War II. If he had lived just a couple of weeks longer, he would have seen Benito Mussolini of Italy executed and hung upside down with his mistress. He would have seen Hitler surrounded by the Soviets, underground in the bunkers, and then committing suicide along with his mistress Eva Braun. Imagine Roosevelt, Hitler, and Mussolini died in April 1945, and then May 5th, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Millions across the world were celebrating. Millions were dead, more millions were homeless and injured, but the war was over. Or at least it was over in Europe. We still had to fight the Japanese, and for this, Roosevelt, of course, would not be around. The new president, Harry S. Truman, would make a crucial decision in that same year to end the war with the Japanese. But that's in our next video. In the meantime, this is Cool Talk. Comment, subscribe. Thank you.